It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Carrie Wolinetz, the Deputy Director for Health and Life Science at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I've had the pleasure of working with Carrie for more than a decade. We first met when she was the Director of Scientific Affairs at the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, FASEB. We collaborated when she was the Deputy Director for Federal Affairs at the Association of American Universities, and we later worked side by side as colleagues at the NIH when Carrie was the Acting Chief of Staff, Associate Director for Science Policy, and the Director of the Office of Science Policy from 2015 until earlier this year when she left to join OSTP. She has a Ph.D. in animal science and also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Carrie has graciously agreed to join us today to talk a little bit about the Biden administration's plans and vision for life science innovation. She and Dr. Eric Lander, who serves as the president's science advisor, come to their roles at OSTP with deep background in biomedical issues and genomics. So I'm sure you'll find Carrie's perspective to be a rich addition to the other content of the meeting this year. Carrie's going to start with a presentation, and following that, we'll have a short Q&A. So Carrie, with that, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Janet, for that gracious introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here today with the audience at ARM. I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person because I would really like more of an opportunity to interact, but I'm glad I could at least join you in this virtual way to tell you a little bit about what we're doing here at OSTP in the Division of Health and Life Sciences. So here at OSTP, our entire agenda is really built on the framework of the vision that was articulated in the letter that President Biden sent to Dr. Eric Lander in inviting him to be his science advisor and elevating the OSTP director to a cabinet level position. If you read this letter, it really sets out a call to develop a vision akin to that of Vannevar Bush, who was President Roosevelt's science advisor, and wrote a pivotal science policy report called Science, the Endless Frontier, which really laid the foundation for a lot of the innovation ecosystem and federal funding infrastructure in research and development that we have today. And one of the things that I find noteworthy, if you take the time to read this letter, if you haven't, I recommend Googling it and taking a look, is that the word health actually appears in nearly every section of the letter. And why this is particularly notable is if you have followed OSTP for any number of years, you'll recognize that the office has primarily focused on the physical sciences. Traditionally, the leader of OSTP has been a physical scientist, a physicist, or a chemist perhaps, nuclear physicist. But Dr. Lander is the first life scientist to head OSTP, and a lot of the president's directive to OSTP is really focused on health and life science. If you think about it, that is not incredibly surprising, given that we are in the midst of this historic pandemic in which science and technology has really proven to be a solution, and particularly in the form of vaccines. And also, as I know I don't have to tell anybody who is part of this alliance, because we really are at sort of an extraordinary point in life sciences where the opportunities for advancement are tremendous. And so it's a really exciting time to bring health and life sciences to OSTP, which brings me to my division. So the OSTP is organized into a series of divisions, and we are one of the newest, the Health and Life Science Division. We are brand new to this administration. We are alongside divisions in science and society, in climate and national security, in energy. And we have a pretty broad ability to set an agenda with a wide aperture, because we are almost literally building the plane while we are flying it. Because we're new, there's a lot of opportunities to really be thoughtful and build. But building off of that framework, in the letter that the president sent to Dr. Lander, we are focused on some early priorities and then building out our agenda in real time. A lot of my time is actively spent trying to get people into OSTP and making sure that we have a great team who can actually go forward and do all of this work that we've laid out. But a lot of our time right now is spent on biopreparedness, particularly pandemic readiness, but also antimicrobial resistance. And I'll say more about that in a minute. We are thinking a lot about health systems and health equity, and in particular, how we can build on some of the lessons we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, thinking through how to better utilize telehealth technologies, community health workers, really fulfill the promise of interoperable electronic health records, strengthen the public health system. And I'll just note a theme throughout is that these are very interconnected priorities. So strengthening the public health system, having interoperable EHRs will actually contribute to pandemic readiness and also accelerate innovation to patients, which is sort of a third major theme that we're focused on. You, I'm sure, have heard about ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Project Agency for Health, which is a landmark initiative of the Biden-Harris administration. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But also the president's commitment to end cancer as we know it, which is a pretty bold goal, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. And thinking through our clinical trials enterprise, again, connected to pandemic readiness, but also connected to the life science ecosystem in general. Biomanufacturing and the bioeconomy, which I know this audience is at the cutting edge of thinking about in terms of innovative therapies in the gene and cellular space, but really thinking through how do we create the ecosystem and the incentives and the infrastructure needed to continue to develop and sustain a really robust life science industry of the future. Because we are life sciences and not just biomedical sciences, of course, we do think outside of the medical research box and focus on agriculture, in particular nutrition, and then ecosystem-wide issues such as doctoral education. How do we really think through training the next generation of doctoral level scientists in the life science? And a lot of this work is cross-fertilized with other divisions in OSTP, in particular, the Science and Society division led by my colleague, Alondra Nelson. And then, of course, there are always more issues that cross our desks than there are hours in the day to address them. And you know, they range from biosafety and biosecurity, which does have some connectivity to pandemic readiness, but also things like social determinants of health and maternal mortality, GDPR, gene editing, and other emerging life science technologies. So there is no shortage of things to address and work we might do. It is certainly never boring here in the White House. So I just want to take a very quick moment to focus briefly on pandemic preparedness. You may have seen this op-ed in the Washington Post that Eric Lander published, mentioning that we would be coming out with a plan to think through what are some of the technological capabilities that we really need to make sure to be prepared for the next pandemic, because we know, in fact, that all evidence suggests that the occurrence of pandemics are going to be of increasing frequency, whether that's due to the effects of climate change or increased global travel or habitat loss. Certainly the risks are greater than they have been previously, and we need to be ready for that. And as promised, in fact, in early September, we did release the American Pandemic Preparedness Transforming Our Capabilities Plan. This is one core component of a much larger Biden-Harris administration strategy on biodefense and pandemic preparedness. But we really wanted to make sure to be out in front to ensure that we've got the resources and the planning necessary for what we consider to be core capabilities that are really critical for being prepared for the next pandemic. And these are organized into 5 categories: transforming our medical defenses, ensuring situational awareness, strengthening public health systems, building core capabilities, which ranges from supply chain issues to regulatory improvements and biosecurity, and a 5th pillar, which is really about organized, coordinated whole of government managing of the mission with the same commitment and seriousness that we've handled previous large-scale science projects like the Apollo mission, the moonshot, for example. And I would just note, because I think you know, when we think about what does pandemic readiness mean to folks who are interested in regenerative medicine, a lot of these core capabilities are really about building platforms in the biotechnology space that could be utilized quickly and in a lot of different ways. So thinking about how do we make sure we have the platform technologies and the manufacturing and regulatory systems to support that kind of platform approach in a way that allows us to be agile and swift in future pandemic responses, so that we can, for example, shorten the amount of time it takes to develop a vaccine to 100 days from when a pathogen first emerges. And key to all of this is keeping these capabilities, what we call quote unquote hot. So you can't take a factory or a regulatory system out of mothballs when the next pandemic hits. You have to have it on sort of a low simmer all the time. And that means we're going to need to be able to use it in periods in between pandemics for other biomedical and public health needs. And so this is potentially an opportunity to really impact everyday health and think about where other biomanufacturing needs and capabilities fit in the between times, between pandemics. Shifting quickly to ARPA-H, just to note that this is still very much in development. We've been doing a ton of listening sessions with more than 5,000 stakeholders have weighed in at this point. So we've gotten a lot of input. And this is the idea that we really want to create a transformative agency built along the DARPA model, although not imitating it completely, within the National Institutes of Health to tackle some of the problems that tend to fall in the space between NIH's approach to basic and clinical research and the private sector's innovation and commercialization of goods, to really come up with transformative research approaches to tackle some of our hardest and most intransigent questions within the life sciences. And this is intended to be very use-driven in order to make sure that we are rapidly advancing progress and getting the treatments that we need to patients. And then you know, just a handful of other priorities that are taking up a lot of our time right now. Of course, if you follow President Biden at all, you probably recognize that, of course, ending cancer as we know it is near and dear to his heart from his time as vice president when he led the cancer moonshot to his presidency now, and he's really challenged the entire medical and research community to think about that. What does that mean exactly? When we think about cancer today, how do we know it, and how do we come up with problems to solve? I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. A real focus on the bioeconomy and thinking through what are all of the pieces that could be used to support that ecosystem. And then, of course, I think it is worth noting, it's so easy to think about these individual issues, that this is an administration that is incredibly supportive of science, as demonstrated by the elevation of the OSTP director to a cabinet level position, and the resources that is willing to propose reflect that commitment, as do all of our activities related to, for example, the current COVID-19 response and addressing other societal challenges like climate change. Most importantly, I'm spending a lot of my time right now doing exactly this, which is engaging with stakeholders on some of these priorities. And with that, I'm going to stop talking. And I look forward to the Q&A with Janet.
Carrie, thanks so much for that overview. Really, really helpful. And obviously there's a ton going on at OSTP already, even as you try to attract the team you need to execute against all of that work. You mentioned at the outset that one of the big changes this administration made was in elevating the science advisor to a cabinet position and elevating the stature of OSTP. Can you say whether that's had any tangible impact as yet in terms of the work of the office?
Well, I will say it's that might be a hard question for me to answer because I don't have anything to compare it to, since I was not in the previous OSTP, but in general, I think that Dr. Lambert being having the direct ear of the president and able to work across the government with secretaries, with other presidential advisors like the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, is really incredibly useful for being able to move things forward and also ensure that we have a high level of attention on the critical problems that we have in science and technology today. I think certainly the quick release of our pandemic preparedness plan demonstrates that we were able to develop and get that out incredibly quickly, is something that I think would have been made far more difficult without the strength of a cabinet level OSTP director.
You also mentioned what probably most of the people watching this know, which is that Dr. Lambert is a world-renowned scientist and luminary, having led the Broad, founded and led the Broad, his role in the Human Genome Project and other things. So how does that expertise bear on his vision for the life sciences and OSTP, and does he come to the role, as far as you're aware, with any particular thoughts or proposals with respect to the cell and gene therapy community?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I will just say, for those who haven't met Eric Lambert, I think he can fairly be described as a polymath, a Renaissance man who actually has expertise in a great number of topics, even though he is most associated, of course, with his work leading the Human Genome Project and at the Broad. And so he brings that knowledge to bear in kind of everything we do at OSTP. But of course, he's previously co-chaired the President's Council of Advisors in Science Technology in the Obama administration. So has a fairly robust sense of the landscape of science policy issues that sort of fall within the OSTP swim lane. And I have personally found it incredibly useful to have a genomics expert at the table as we've fleshed out some of these priority areas and really begun to think about what can we do. A lot of what drives us here in OSTP, again, building off of that letter from the president, is we really like to think about what is the vision that we want to see achieved. You know, what is the change that we want to see in the world, the problem that we wish to have solved, and then working backwards from there. And so I think certainly there's a lot of interconnectivity, not only between the priorities that I talked about, but actually in thinking through the cell and gene therapy space, a lot of interconnectivity between regenerative medicine and those priorities, whether that are, those are things like innovative clinical trials, or, you know, thinking about regulatory streamlining. Certainly, I think there's a lot of potential ways in which not just genomics, but cell and gene therapy in general kind of fit within this matrix of priorities.
One more question about sort of the role of OSTP before we dive a little bit more deeply into some of the priorities you outlined. But could you help the folks at the meeting understand, again, given this vantage point of now being part of the cabinet, what role Dr. Lambert plays in some of the non-research issues that are prevalent right now? So for example, one of the things our community is really paying attention to is the nomination of a permanent FDA commissioner. And I'm wondering if that's a kind of issue that Dr. Lambert is involved in. A second example would probably be, obviously there's been a lot of deliberation about booster shot recommendations and so forth. Is the science advisor enmeshed in those decisions that, even though they may be, you know, largely invested at HHS or other agencies?
I can't speak to those conversations specifically, but in general, first, the president can ask his science advisor for advice on whatever he chooses, because he's the president, and that is his job in a lot of ways. So certainly, I think that OSTP gets involved in conversations across the spectrum of science and health and technology policy, you know, working often in close conjunction with other parts of the White House, like the Domestic Policy Council or the National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, for example, having a co-equal seat at that table as some of those conversations move forward. So yes, I think there are a lot of opportunities, but I will just say in general, because I never want to assume that anyone has ever heard of OSTP or has any idea of what we do, that OSTP, like many White House components, the real strength that we bring is, first of all, being able to speak to the priorities of the President of the United States, but also really to convene and coordinate within and outside of government, to be able to you know, cross the silos that are just a natural part of any organization, as complex as the federal government, and bring relevant stakeholders across the US government to the table to work together to solve common problems.
You talked about kind of the vision for ARPA-H and all of the listening sessions that you've had, and we were happy and privileged to be part of some of those listening sessions. As we think about ARPA-H, right, one of the things ARM does is track investment in the regenerative medicine and in the sector globally. And one of the kind of realities of the moment is that investors are extremely enthusiastic about these therapies and the impact that they can have on patients. And so we saw a really record-breaking level of investment in cell and gene therapy companies and tissue-based therapies in the first 6 months of this year. So more than $14 billion poured into the sector in just 6 months' time, which is just incredible. So now we're tracking something like 1,200 companies in this space, and and thousands of trials. So despite that huge influx of capital, obviously there are still scientific and technical challenges facing the field. So I'm wondering if at this point, I know it's early days, but at this point in the process, if you and your team have some preliminary ideas about programs that ARPA-H might undertake that would have that would touch on the challenges in our field.
It's a great question. First of all, it's an incredibly exciting industry. So really thanks and congratulations to everyone who is doing the work, because it's a really, I mean, just an amazing time in cellular and gene therapy. You know, the level of conversations we are having now in ARPA-H, to be perfectly candid, aren't at that level of granularity. You know, our job is really to create a mechanism to bring on the right kinds of leaders and program managers to be able to have those conversations. So, you know, right now, ARPA-H really represents a blank slate of possibility in the best possible way, with the idea that by bringing on very talented program managers, you know, akin to the way DARPA operates, and a really powerful, innovative leader, that we will be able to move swiftly and actualize some early ideas coming in. So right now, we're not at the program building level, but we are taking in all of that input to be able to pass it on to the team that is ultimately going to be running ARPA-H to make sure they can hit the ground running.
You know, one of the things that DARPA had going for it was a really clear sense of the customer, right? You know, the warfighter as customer. In healthcare, the customer, or in life sciences, you know, the customer can be a little bit more diffuse. And I wonder if there's how in your thinking about ARPA-H, you're thinking about that.
Yeah, this is also a great question, and one that I hear often. Yes, this is one way in which I think it's really important to differentiate DARPA from ARPA-H. I mean, there are some things that are true of the DARPA model that will not necessarily be true of ARPA-H, and certainly the single customer is a large part of that. I mean, at the end of the day, really, the customer who will benefit from the technologies or advances that are emerging from ARPA-H are the American people, and hopefully the health of the American people specifically, which is a large and intimidating mandate. But fortunately, we have such a robust biomedical innovation ecosystem in this country that it is not a just sort of wide open space, because ARPA-H will not be replicating that with those pieces of the ecosystem that are already working really well. NIH, in terms of basic and clinical research, already working really well, and we don't want to mess with that. The biotechnology industry, the private sector companies who are bringing innovations to the marketplace, we don't want to mess with that either. It's really that space in between that we see as the sweet spot of ARPA-H, and that does put some boundaries on the types of problems that could and should be tackled by that agency. Although, unfortunately, is not as DARPA would probably not appreciate me calling it easy as having the Department of Defense as your sole customer.
Yeah, you mentioned that obviously the president has both a longstanding, both personal and professional interest in tackling cancer. And that's obviously a place that a lot of the ARM community is also focused. Some of the first therapies in this space are CAR T therapies targeting blood cancers, and they're showing really profound impact on patients who really had run out of options. We see when we look at the pipeline now, over half of the of the clinical trial pipeline in regenerative medicine is focused on immuno-oncology. There's all sorts of applications of gene editing to combined with cell therapy to tackle both liquid tumors, but obviously people are trying to develop therapies that could tackle the more prevalent solid tumors. So it's a period of great excitement, you know, terrific early progress and lots of scientific advance, trying to tackle even more significant parts of the problem. So when the president talks about trying to end cancer as we know it and undertake a program to do so, how do you think that the companies and the research institutions kind of in our world are most likely to feel the impact of that in the work that they're doing?
Thanks. So the president, of course, as you mentioned, and the first lady have long had a personal and professional interest in this topic. And as we've been thinking across the White House in terms of what does that mean to end cancer as we know it, I think you often get the question, does this compare to the war on cancer of previous administrations? You know, are we going to cure cancer in 5 years? And I think what we are really focusing on is, how do we know cancer today? We know it as a disease in which we have very few ways to prevent many types of cancer. We know it as a disease where early detection can make a huge difference, but we don't have a lot of technologies and methodologies that are easy to use for early detection. We know it as for patients and their caregivers, potentially, a difficult and isolating experience. We know it as a disease where, while we've made tremendous progresses on some kinds of cancer, other kinds of cancer have proven to be intractable, and we've made very little progress at all, although you've cited some examples where it does seem like we have really made tremendous strides in recent years. And thinking through that knowledge base, how do we then think about how do we move the needle and change the world to end each of those scenarios? How do we think about cancer as a preventable illness? Is that through vaccines? Is it through some other kinds of prophylaxis that we haven't been imaginative enough to invent yet? What kinds of technologies can be made available for early detection? How do we address some of these intractable cancers? And thinking about this through the lens of the patient experience, I think is incredibly important. Their diagnostic odyssey and journey throughout the cancer experience, and also thinking about it through a lens of equity. And on some of these questions, the experiences are going to be very, very different depending on what community within our nation you belong to, and how do we create not just more positive experiences that end cancer as we know it today, but also more equitable experiences, so that the when we see a failure to detect cancer, or we see negative outcomes with treatment, that those aren't due to inequitable access to the healthcare system or technologies or screening or anything else that could ultimately improve the health of any American who is unfortunately diagnosed with cancer.
So it sounds like then there's still some shaping, because that sounds like a lot of deep thinking, and as you said, kind of trying to pick the right targets for how do you change the world and the experience that, you know, the ARM community, but more importantly patients experience when they're faced with a cancer journey for themselves or their family. Is the office working towards any particular milestone akin to the pandemic report, or will this will this initiative kind of take shape piece by piece?
So this is very much a work in progress. So stay tuned, I would generally say. There are some set activities that have already been announced. For example, through our bilateral work with the UK, we will be having at some point in the not too distant future a UK-US bilateral cancer summit to think about ways in which our two nations can collaborate together to address this question of ending cancer as we know it. And there will still be more to come. So stay tuned.
Watch this space.
Yes, exactly.
You know, Carrie, another place we've had a chance to work together in the past is around gene editing and the kind of international dialogue around gene editing, both from an ethical perspective and, from a global regulatory perspective. Can you say anything about what what the thinking is inside of OSTP about the steps that the WHO has already taken in this regard, but maybe more importantly, should we be expecting any policy initiatives around gene editing to come out of this White House?
So, in absolute truthfulness, we haven't been focused on it because of the nearer term focus on things like pandemic preparedness and cancer, which isn't to say that it may not enter the radar screen and agenda. It's not something we're spending a lot of time now beyond sort of a general focus on emerging biotechnologies in the context of the bioeconomy or biosecurity, for example.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. So I'll key off your reference to the bioeconomy. As we talked about a little bit earlier in this conversation, we're fortunate to be in a really thriving section of the economy. And as has been the case with biotech, traditionally, the US is really a leader in that sector, thanks to kind of a lot of components of a virtuous circle, starting with NIH and including kind of the capital markets here in the United States and the reimbursement environment and a whole bunch of other things that has made the US the world leader in biotech and also in regenerative medicine. Right now, the biggest problem our companies have is hiring people, is that there aren't enough people who know how to manufacture these therapies, that we've got a new generation of manufacturing, which is sort of biotech manufacturing, and we're having a really hard time kind of growing the workforce that we need at the rate we need them. And I'm wondering, as you guys think about that, about the bioeconomy, you mentioned kind of graduate education, but are there other workforce initiatives that might have a bearing on our community that you're thinking about?
Yeah, so this is another place where I'm frustratingly going to say, stay tuned. Hopefully more to say soon. But I will say in general, because this has clearly been a public part of the president's agenda, is we're quite committed to support and driving forward the bioeconomy. And certainly if anyone has been tuned in recently to the meeting of the new President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, where the US fits into the global competitive landscape and in research and development, bio is certainly a huge part of that. And so thinking about how do we make sure that we have a bioeconomy in the broadest sense of that term that is competitive and well set up, not just to address the health challenges and the biomedical innovations that ARM is involved in, but also bringing bio-based solutions to food security and climate change and innovative industries, whether that are new dyes or new industrial practices. But you're absolutely right that there are common threads among them, including a robust biomanufacturing sector. This again is a little bit of cross connectivity with what we're thinking about in pandemic preparedness, where we think to really be prepared for the next pandemic, we need to have a robust biomanufacturing sector, and that's not just buildings with bricks and machines, it's also the people needed to run that. So we are thinking about this in a very holistic way, and thinking about what are the opportunities to create that robust bioeconomy, ranging from infrastructure to workforce to other opportunities. So I hope that we'll be able to say more about that soon.
Yeah. Well, listen, thanks so much for taking some time to talk with us in the midst of all you've got going on. As you said, we're very sorry you couldn't come and join us in person, but we'll leave a standing invitation only for when travel gets a bit easier. And I think I hope it goes without saying that we are eager to engage with you on all of these topics to both help shape a policy that makes sense nationally, and also to make sure that you have all the information that you need about what's happening in regenerative medicine and kind of the pressure points on the cell and gene therapy community. So thanks again for joining us and for your time today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and enjoy the Mesa.
Thank you.